The morning began in stillness. Aanya stood at the kitchen sink, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, staring at the world outside as if waiting for it to offer her a decision she didn't want to make. The sun poured in reluctantly, weak and pale, as if even the sky knew this was the kind of day when nothing should be too bright. Inside her something was quiet. Not peace, not quite, but a tired kind of surrender. The kind that comes after too many questions with no good answers. Dev moved behind her, careful not to touch. They had developed a choreography, one that let them share space without intimacy. He passed behind her for the kettle. She didn't move. He didn't ask her to. The silence between them was no longer cold, just fragile, like glass stretched too thin. "Any plans today?" he asked. She shook her head. "Number I might go to the bookstore." He nodded. "Okay." And that was it. That's how they lived now, speaking in half sentences and quiet permissions. Aanya wondered if this was what compromise felt like. Not agony, just the dull hum of choosing the same thing over and over, even when it no longer lit you from within. She sat on the edge of the bed later that afternoon, scrolling. Rayen's name hadn't popped up in days, and yet her fingers hovered over the chat like it might call to her. She hadn't deleted the messages. Couldn't. Not when they still hummed with a warmth her current world lacked. She opened the last voice note from him, not to listen, just to remember the curve of his voice, the way it dipped when he said her name. "If you asked, I'd come, even if it wrecked everything." He'd said it like a prayer, or a curse, and she believed him. That was the problem. She stared at the screen until the edges blurred, until the phone grew hot in her hand and her chest heavier with each breath. A message waited in her notes app, half finished. "I think I dreamed you into being." She hadn't sent it. She never would. That evening, Dev returned home with takeout. They sat side by side on the couch, watching a movie neither of them cared about. Aanya picked at her food. Dev didn't eat much either. The silence had shape now. It sat between them like a third person, uninvited but ever present. Halfway through the film, she spoke. "I almost met him." Dev didn't flinch, didn't pause, just muted the TV. "When?" he asked. "Last week," she said. I was in the car. I sat outside the cafe." "But you didn't." "No." He nodded slowly, then turned to face her fully. "Why?" She stared at the muted screen. "Because if I saw him, I don't think I could have come back." A beat passed. Dev exhaled deep and quiet. "You already left. You just kept your body here." The words didn't come with anger. They came with grief, like he was mourning something that had died while he wasn't looking. Aanya turned to him then, her eyes soft. "I don't want to hurt you." "You already have." "I know," she whispered. He looked at her like he was trying to memorize the version of her he still recognized. "Did he love you?" She blinked. "I think. He loved the part of me that still believed in magic." Dev nodded again, jaw clenched. "And you?" he asked. "Did you love him?" Anya's answer came not with certainty but with ache. "I loved what he reminded me I could feel." Somewhere across the city, Rayen was pacing. He hadn't written to her since the missed meeting, hadn't messaged, hadn't called. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But a part of him already knew how this ended. She wouldn't leave. She couldn't. He'd seen it in her silences, in the way her texts grew shorter, in the way she never used the word soon anymore. He still had her laugh saved in a voice note. He played it sometimes, not to hold on to hope, but to remember what it had felt like to be wanted by someone who glowed quietly in a world that never noticed. He sat down at his desk and wrote a message he would never send. "In another life, I'd hold your hand in public. I'd take you dancing. I'd kiss your forehead in the morning and call you mine without shame. But in this one, I'll just thank you for waking me up." Then he closed the app and stared at the wall for a long time. Aanya began packing old books that night, not because she was moving, just because clutter had begun to make her anxious. She found one Rayen had recommended, something about time and parallel lives. She hadn't finished it, couldn't. It hurt too much to imagine a world where they might have existed in daylight. She set it aside. Dev passed behind her, paused, then picked it up. "This his?" he asked. She nodded. He didn't speak, just handed it back and walked away. Later that night, he found her sitting on the floor by the bed, back against the wall, her hands in her hair. She wasn't crying, but she looked like she'd run out of ways to pretend she was okay. He sat beside her, not touching. After a long moment, she whispered, "I wanted him to ask me to run." Dev's eyes closed, not in pain, in understanding. "And if he had?" She looked at him raw. "I might have said yes." The silence that followed was not anger, it was honesty. "I would have hated you," Dev said. She nodded. "I would have hated myself." The next morning they didn't speak. They moved around each other like ghosts wearing familiar skin. She made toast. He boiled eggs. The radio played soft classical music like nothing had shattered the night before. Then just before she left for work, Dev said, "I think I'm going to my parents this weekend." She turned to him, confused. "Oh, okay. Just a few days, space." She nodded. "I'm not punishing you," he added. "I just need to breathe where you don't smell like him." Her eyes welled, but she held the tears back. "I understand." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead. It was the most tender thing he had done in weeks, and somehow it made her cry more than anything else. Rayen sat at the pier that night, watching the waves. He didn't check his phone, he didn't hope. Somewhere inside, he had accepted the quiet between them. Still, he whispered her name into the sea breeze once, just to know what it sounded like when no one else was listening. A week passed, then two. Aanya returned to her routines. Dev came back from his parents. They coexisted. They tried. She didn't message Rayen again. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew the story had already ended. They had just been too gentle to close the book. She kept one photo of him. Nothing scandalous. Just his hand holding a coffee cup in soft light. She never showed it to anyone. Sometimes late at night she'd scroll to it, let herself smile, then sleep beside a man who loved her deeply, if not completely. They never spoke of him again. She and Dev rebuilt something. Not what they had before, but something quieter, more adult, less fever, more forgiveness. It wasn't perfect, but it held. Rayen met someone eventually. Not a great love, but a good one. A kind girl who liked poetry and didn't mind silence. He told her once, quietly, that he'd almost fallen in love with a married woman. The girl didn't ask questions. He appreciated that. Aanya turned 36. Dev bought her flowers. She baked herself a cake. When the guests left, she stood on the balcony alone, phone in her hand. She didn't call Rayen, but she looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you." And somewhere in the city, though he'd never hear it, he would have said it back. Some love stories don't end in breakups. They end in a single decision that no one speaks of again. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real to survive the life they had already built. This was not a story of betrayal. It was a story of longing, restraint, and the quiet devastation of almost. What would you do if you were Aanya? Like, subscribe, and turn on notification for more ink and intimacy stories.